Welcome, everyone. We've got lots of folks coming into the room, and we are live on Facebook. And for folks, as folks might know, we're going to be recording today. If I can figure out my recording part of this. My name is Fernando Marti. I have been with the Council of Community Housing Organizations for the last 12 years, and it is my honor to introduce Maya Chupkov, who was our communications director at Chupkov for several years, and really led us into this project working with Berkeley Media Studies Group and BARHII to look at housing reporting around the Bay Area and around the state. So we've got a great lineup of housing reporters. For us, it is always really exciting when we see some amazingly good reporting. And, we're always critics. So we've always got, if they had only asked this other person, or if they'd only gotten this other question in. So it's really good to talk to reporters and to learn around the situations that you all face and how we all, I think, as a community of folks who want to be well informed and be able to move policy, to move the conversation in the public, to learn from each other on how we get better, more exciting, more impactful housing reporting. So with that, I will turn it over to Maya, who's going to moderate for us today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am very honored to be moderating with all of you today. So my name is Maya Chupkov, and I am the Media and Democracy Program Manager for California Common Cause. And today we will be talking about housing reporting and the intersections of that reporting on public health. We have a great discussion for you today from Berkeley Media Studies Group, BARHII. I can never say their entire name, so sorry about that. And reporters working with the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Business Times, and Cal Matters. Before I introduce our panelists, I would love to welcome folks to introduce themselves via chat, where they are from and where they work. And so with that, I am going to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Kathi Schaff. Kathi works at Berkeley Media Studies Group, a nonprofit that has worked for 30 years with community groups, journalists, and public health professionals to use the power of the media to advance healthy public policy. Before working at BMSG, Kathi worked at the Alameda County Public Health Department. Next, we have Darris Young, the impact manager of African Americans and Pacific Islanders at the Bay Area Regional Health Equities Initiative, also known as BARHII. Darris grew up in the East Bay from Oakland to Berkeley to Richmond, working to prevent youth of color from being caught up in the criminal justice system is his passion. Manuela Tobias writes about statewide housing policy in Sacramento for Cal Matters and co-hosts the Gimme Shelter podcast. We also have Laura Wenus, is a local multimedia journalist covering San Francisco with a focus on housing, development, public health, and equity issues. And finally, Laura Waxmann, she's a real estate reporter with the SF Business Times. So welcome to our lovely panelists. So why this panel? So communications matters for housing justice. Affordable housing and land use policies are super complex, and there's so many nuances. And so in this panel, we'll explore where advocates and reporters are working effectively and how they can do a better job and tell fuller stories that include solutions. And as we all know, housing is overwhelming unless we give people insights that leads to hope, and news stories and journalism can really show people things can work and that there are solutions out there. Our equation is that well-informed sources and skilled journalists leads to better stories that inform the public and policymakers. And with that, I will hand it over to our first panelist, Kathi Schaff.
Thank you, Maya. Really honored to be here today with this panel. Housing, health, and communication is an intersection I really care deeply about. So this is just an amazing opportunity, and it's really great to see everyone in the chat where you're coming from. Hope we have a lot of time for dialogue and connecting. Sorry, I was just checking the chat to see what somebody added. And I'm just hopeful that we can have some concrete ways to move forward together. As Maya mentioned, reporting on housing and being an advocate talking about housing is very complicated compared to some other issues. And so we're seeing a lot of successes though, and ways to move forward. So I'm from Berkeley Media Studies Group, BMSG. We're a small nonprofit. We've been around for about 30 years, and we really care about how we think about the factors that affect health. And so we look at the news as one measure of narratives, what shapes what we believe as a public and what maybe holds our policymakers accountable. We also do trainings for advocates, community groups, public health folks, and we do some education for journalists as well. And so just excited to be here for all of this. And I'm just going to launch in. I'm going to set some ground setting for the, why we're thinking about the news and why it matters. And then we'll be able to turn it over to everyone else. So one question we get often at Berkeley Media Studies Group is, does the news steal even matter in today's age? Absolutely, yes. We have research that shows this, and it's absolutely critical, even more so now in some ways. How we define problems in the news really shapes what solutions even seem viable, and really are one of the mechanisms we have to shape healthier communities. And so we often ask, about different issues. If the only way people got their information on housing was from the news, what would they know and what wouldn't they know? And especially looking at policy, equity, or solutions. And we know that the news media is really the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and that these stories add up to have immense power. And so when we can shape these stories to tell a fuller picture, it can really shape what we believe is possible. A lot of other research shows that there's major functions the news serves in our society, even as news shifts. It sets the agenda. What do we think about housing, or if housing is even on our radar? It shapes the debate, how we think about it, what solutions seem viable. Are we just thinking individuals need to do better, or are we looking at systems? And it is one mechanism for reaching decision makers and shaping what we do about it, what's on the policy agenda. So some of what we know from research is that generally on a lot of news issues, everything from gun violence to housing, 80% of the news is often focused on portrait stories that really portray individual story that might be compelling, might engage us, but sometimes emphasize personal responsibility or rugged individualism as a narrative. And only about 20% of news stories focus on what we at BMSG call a landscape view, and that holds institutions, decision makers, and others accountable. We have seen a shift in this more recent housing news. We just did a national news analysis, and we are seeing a lot more landscape stories in housing. So we find that to be really promising, and maybe even an example for other issues that we are concerned about in public health. So we know that news is set against the backdrop of these long-standing frames. Personal responsibility, rugged individualism is a deeply ingrained default frame, default narrative in the United States. And when we only report on that, or when we only see stories on that, it can make it really difficult to see the systems that are creating these issues. When news stories focus on portraits and they're not portraits of individuals and they're not embedded in landscapes, it's harder for policymakers and the public to see what needs to change. And we know that journalists don't set out to reinforce rugged individualism, but it's just so embedded in our society. And storytelling, in all shapes and forms, from popular media to news, often focuses on people and events instead of embedding them in a landscape and making those connections to systems, policies, structures. And that can reinforce the idea that if someone is failing or having poor health, it's their fault, rather than looking for the systems for accountability and for solutions. So this is just one example of a portrait frame. All of these stories are important. Somebody who gets COVID loses their job and might get evicted, and it's not a complete story. That this person who might be evicted, it's really might be more about the tenant and the landlord. But what people might not know is that this has happening in waves across the country. It's predicated on decades of policy, and that there's people benefiting from these policies who are connected to legislators. And so a landscape frame might pull back the lens to expose the environment, the systems, and the structures in which health happens. It broadens the responsibility from individuals just to figure out their own housing crisis to collective responsibility. And it opens the door to talk about systems and policy change, as well as things like structural racism and racial justice. And when news stories leave out solutions or only focus on individual solutions, it can just make housing justice feel impossible and hopeless. And the story on the right, we really like because not only does it name specifically who is taking actions that are creating problems, but it shows tenants not just as victims, but as people with power and agency and people who can help us move out of this crisis and move forward. And that's a little bit different perspective than we often see in the news. So just want to say that there is a lot of shift, that there are ways that journalists and advocates are telling different stories and reaching the public and policymakers with these stories. So a few years ago, there was a regional push to address the housing crisis, and a group of advocates actually led by the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities, BARHII, where Darris is from and he'll speak next, facilitated a small group that was really focused on getting equity and solutions in the news. And this shows that they did. We looked at the news coverage on the overall housing crisis, and then we compared it to news about this regional process, which, it had problems in some of the process and outcomes, but was, did offer a venue to get news coverage on equity. And we found much more coverage of solutions. So again, a lot of coverage, a lot of our public health data focuses on the problem, but when we can show that there's solutions, it allows people to understand that there are ways out of the housing crisis. And so we were really heartened by this, this change in the data with just a little investment. And then another way that we are, very excited to see this collaboration between a lot of the organizations online, CHU, the Council of Community Housing Organizations, BARHII, and several other organizations led a reporters roundtable on a Black-led COVID recovery, and really talked about Black leaders and they're tackling the dual crisis of COVID and racism and building a better world for all of us. And Laura, who is also going to speak, focused on this in one of her stories. And it really, when we set this up, we wanted to show, again, not just who's harmed and who's a victim, but show Black leadership as a visionary way that all of us are going to do better in getting out of COVID. And there was also a focus on housing in this. And so, this took a lot of work, it took a lot of prep, and the reporters were absolutely vital in then turning it into stories. But when we invest some resources into the advocate side of the equation and the journalist side of the equation, we are seeing change, and we are seeing different stories that have been out there that can help people understand what's happening and how they might be a part of a movement towards housing justice and health equity for all. And so that's just a little bit of the grounding. We have a lot of resources online. We love to talk about this stuff, and we love to try to help people, again, on both sides of the equations, from public health practitioners and advocates and activists to journalists. And we're partnering with the Council of Community Housing Organizations and BARHII to create a journalist toolkit that will be out soon. That also supports journalists, because housing is, as Maya said, extremely complex. There's a lot of different players, there's a lot of jargon, and it is a hard story on both sides to tell. And so the more we can support each other in bringing those untold stories out, the more the public and policymakers will have access to a fuller picture on housing justice, health. So I will pass it on to Darris, and looking forward to all the questions in the chat and talking more. Darris, I think you're on mute.
Okay, let me start it. Thank you, Kathi, for the wonderful introduction and everything that you have contributed to housing and the way it's reported in the news. My name is Darris Young, and I am with BARHII, as was mentioned, and that does stand for Bay Area Regional Health Inequity Initiative. And we were founded to work on issues of health that occur outside of the doctor's office. We are the governmental body of the 9 Bay Area health departments. And so in about 2018, BARHII was in partnership with the Federal Reserve, and they did help to conduct some research on housing. And what was found out is that housing issues are greatly related to the disparities and the impacts on health. And that's especially true for African American communities. And so what we did was most recently, we actually started to develop what we call a Black housing strategy. And what that did was it brought 40 African American-led organizations together to start thinking about what can be some regional strategies to help to offset some of the major things that have happened around, African Americans in housing. And we know there's a lot of things that have been happening when it comes to BIPOC related issues, and especially those around homelessness. But what we found was that we needed to help develop some type of coordinated strategy that would focus on Black people being rapidly displaced. So just let me quote a few statistics, what we have on that. Over the last 25 years, we see that African Americans are leaving from San Francisco at the rate of 43%. Oakland was 40%, Berkeley 49%, East Palo Alto 66%, and they were moving to places such as Brentwood, Antioch, Elk Grove, and other outlying areas. We saw that why people were moving is because Black people are looking for affordability, home ownership, and also better living environments, which were not readily available or was not happening. And so through this strategy, what we did was we most recently we are hoping to create a $500 million funding pool from the state that would really what we call develop what we call a cycle of the development. And so this virtual cycle of development would actually look at not only home ownership, but also it would look at helping Black developers to be a part of the equation, asset retention, all those things that become focuses on wealth building. And these are the type of things that actually help to maintain communities and also build structure so that African American communities as well as others will be able to flourish. And so right now, that's been a lot of our focus for our housing piece, because people always ask, well, you know, if you guys directly were founded to work on issues outside of the doctor's office, where does health come in? But health equity and housing goes hand in hand. And so right now, I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., where we are in a conference for grounded solutions. And a lot of that is focusing on like land trusts throughout the country. And what you see is those same disparities that are happening, you know, in the Bay Area are happening outside of California. But what we have seen so far is that the Bay Area and California have far outpaced most of the other urban centers in the region in terms of displacement.
Thank you, Darris and Kathi, for starting us off. I want to open the discussion up now to our journalists and welcome them into the conversation. And really, I want this to be more of a discussion rather than like a Q&A between myself and the reporters. So feel free to be flexible in the questions. And so I'm going to just start us off with our first question here, and this is for all of our journalists. So for all sides of the equation, sources, reporters, policymakers, what has worked in successful housing reporting and what has been challenging? And I'll start off with, let's start off with Manuela.
Hello, that's a hard question. I think that Kathi earlier made a really great point about the going after sort of systemic stories as opposed to individual ones. You know, I cover housing at the statewide level, and it's really hard to get from the policy perspective. I'm based in Sacramento, and it's really hard to get to all of the issues, there being so many that affect housing and homelessness in California. And so the way that, and I've been in this role for about a year now, and the way that I've gone about it is really trying to focus on sort of the bigger picture state level programs. And so a challenge is definitely, you know, I get a lot of people writing to me with individual stories, with issues that they're facing, many people in really terrible situations. And it's really hard because I often can't help or really tell them what to do because there is so much overlap between local policies that often affect tenants compared with statewide ones. But what I think has worked best for me is sort of looking at systems. So for example, rent relief. I looked at what contractor the state hired to work on distribution and bringing some accountability that way. Looking at distribution of funds, how much had actually gone out versus what had been promised and said to have gone out. So kind of just questioning the public announcements and discourse from the state, and just asking the type of questions that tenants are having and landlords and just everyone across the board, trying to break down these very complex issues in a way that sort of the average reader is wondering. I think just asking those questions from our state officials and staying on top of these programs even after maybe they've left the news cycle a little bit, has been my approach. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's what came to mind.
Thank you. And do either of the Lauras want to jump in on that question?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. I absolutely want to echo what Manuela said about following up. I think that is crucial. So many times in our work, I think we are, I don't want to use the word bombarded, but we have a lot of people asking for us to pay attention and to shine a light on many different things. And often it's new programs, new initiatives, new attempts, new solutions. And really for us, the question I think is, well, does this work? And if it's at the very outset of the thing beginning or launching, we don't know yet. In fact, nobody knows yet. And so follow-up is really key to that. And I've worked, so I'm not speaking for any particular news organization, just to have that on the record, but I have worked in a couple different mediums, and across the board, I think one thing that's really crucial to making a housing story work, in the sense that it's compelling and it's new and it gets a lot of attention, which is what you want on news stories ultimately, right? Is you want people to consume that news so that the word gets out about the thing you're writing about. For it to be compelling and for it to be accurate, which is also huge, I think a lot of what we need is access. We need access to information. We need access to records that are public records. We need access to people who are willing to share their experiences. It was interesting hearing about how the framing of an individual's experience can lead us to think about things more in terms of personal responsibility rather than the systemic frameworks. But it's also, there's that, I think it's research that shows that ideas stick in our minds when we hear stories. And so to make something compelling and for it to stick and for people to understand it and be engaged in it, you need some kind of story. And that doesn't come from just documents, or honestly, sometimes it doesn't come from press releases. I mean, it kind of just depends on what's in, what kind of stories are being shared in the press event. But we need to hear from people about their own experiences, because that's how we can tell the stories that will make a story actually have impact, or make an article actually have impact.
Well said. I don't know how much I can add to that, but I would agree with all of those points from both of these really smart ladies. Yeah, I think, follow-up those have been some of my best stories. That the stories that have had the most impact have been the ones that I have followed up on and have had consistent coverage on. And I think what is helpful to me as a reporter, because as Laura just said, we are all being pulled in a million different directions in a single day, and it's just hard to sometimes stay on top of the updates. So I think if our sources, the people that we're working with, the advocates, kind of nudge us every once in a while and provide us with updates, or just point us to, there's a development in the story that you covered, you should take a look, draw our attention there, that is really helpful, and that's helped me just be able to stay on top of issues that are important.
Awesome.
I'd like to add something too on solutions. I think that, just like how, because I agree that, as you stated in your presentation, that solutions and presenting sort of alternatives is a really important role that we play. And that's a huge challenge, because we are held to the same standards for presenting solutions as we are to presenting problems. So we need comprehensive data, and not just anecdotes when something is working. And so I got a lot of press releases about, this initiative just launched, and it sounds very promising, but it's really crucial for us too to be able to show, usually through data, what kind of an impact something has made. And so not just anecdotal, just as it can be problematic to point to an anecdote, to point out an issue, a problem, it's just as necessary to be able to back up the solutions in evidence. And so that I do think that as an industry, we should be pushing towards more reporting more on solutions, but I do just want to put it out there that it's not easy either, because even those who are working on solutions sometimes struggle to show some of that evidence. And so I guess when it comes to an ask, when people are pitching these positive stories, it's show me how much of an impact this has made. How is this scalable? It's really those same journalistic process.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that and want to emphasize that. I think another aspect of it is, when I say we need access to people's stories, I mean in a way where we can interact with a person who is experiencing something rather than just having a story sort of served up, because for us, it's so important to do that probing and to ask for the questions and to better understand. And I think that there's sometimes this sense of tension with reporters who are asking critical questions, and we have to ask those critical questions in order to better understand, because the last thing that any of us want is for the story to come out and then someone to say afterward, you got this wrong. Well, I really would have wanted to understand it from the get-go, because I don't want to get things wrong, and I don't think anybody else wants us to get things wrong either.
I can just add, I asked Maya if it was okay if I jumped in the chat, because so much of what everyone's saying is resonating. And I just want to lift up that I think this panel is one of the steps towards actually, working on both parts of those equations. We work with so many people who are terrified of speaking to a journalist. Even when we do mock activities, they start sweating, their heartbeat starts racing. And I think things like this sort of demystify journalism for advocates, for public health folks, for housing folks, in that it shows, that reporters really are trying to have these high standards, are really trying to get to the truth, are really trying to help the public understand what is happening. And that, in a lot of ways, we're working towards the same goal. And if we can sort of demystify the process and also hear directly from reporters, what do you need? Then as advocates, we can be much better prepared to serve that up in a way that is helpful. And so some of the things, we tend to do a lot of work on sort of the housing justice and public health side of helping people prepare to speak to reporters. And some of the things that we think are really important and that are really challenging, especially in housing, is some of the things you mentioned, connecting this very complex issue that has local policy, county policy, state policy, federal policy. And advocates are not always great at talking about that succinctly and then talking about why it matters, leading with why it matters, how it impacts people. They might have a lot of data or jargon, but it's, to talk succinctly about all of that together is very hard. So practicing, we just try to get people to practice. The more you talk about it, the better. I also think connecting across issues. How does housing affect education or land use, or how is it connected to incarceration, so that we are painting a more comprehensive picture on the advocacy side, and thinking about, how does this one episodic policy moment link to history in the future. So we've done a lot of work on the eviction moratorium during COVID. That is a critical story. And it's really hard to talk about that and link it to what was happening pre-COVID with evictions. It was already a problem way before COVID. And there's a lot of reasons for that problem. And there were a lot of solutions proposed before COVID. And then now, as attention wanes on COVID, evictions are still a problem. So how do we link those things together and link the eviction crisis to other things like homelessness, to all of the health impacts, to some of the Black-led work that Darris is talking about? And again, it's very hard as an advocate to say all that succinctly and to put materials forward that aren't just full of jargon. But that's the work that we have to do to be better prepped to talk to reporters. And then I think the access is really critical. We often have our own stories or are connected to people who have really important stories to share, who are undergoing or facing some of these things that we would hope no one would have to face. But are also conveying great leadership and agency and building power to make change. And again, we see a lot of people are really nervous about sharing their story, to reporters. And so there's a lot of work we can do to prepare the people who have been most harmed by our systems to be out in front and to talk about their story in a way that also, of course, is a compelling entree, but to connect it to the landscape, connect it to all of the people experiencing this, connect it to the data, connect it to the history, connect it to the future. And that is a skill that, takes time and practice. So on our end, as much as we can build the ability of people who are most harmed to feel very comfortable sharing their story and connecting it across this landscape, the easier it'll be for journalists to then pick out things that are easier to share and easier to report on. Not easy work, but that's why we're here today together.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think that's so interesting to hear as a person who's on the reporting side, because one of the things that I have often told people when I'm about to do an audio interview with them is try not to repeat your talking points. Don't rehearse beforehand. Don't read off a script, because as a consumer of news, as the reader, the listener, the viewer, I don't want that. I want to hear what feels like honesty. I want honest discourse that brings me into the conversation. And the other thing that I've always been warned against in this kind of reporting is emphasizing how complicated something is, because actually listeners don't want to feel talked down to. They want to feel like they can grasp this and they don't need to have, a PhD in order to understand it. And I think that's, difficult. Like you said, it's a tall order, but it is something that we can do by, it's our job. I think it's our job as journalists. And so it's interesting to hear that from your end, you're trying to prepare and make sure that you do link everything back to how it fits into the bigger picture. And I think from our end, I mean, just speaking for myself in a variety of different assignments, I've had pressure on my end to don't try to boil the ocean, don't try to make this link to every other thing under the sun, because otherwise it gets too complicated and too big. And that's what makes people start to kind of lose interest and drift away.
Yeah, I think it's challenging. I think there are some people who can do it well. And so definitely it's not always what people would lead with, but I think when we can make those connections, it can help people understand the housing landscape and the connections, and that, for example, this eviction moratorium doesn't stand alone, that it's connected to a lot more historical things that have happened pre-COVID. And really appreciate, again, it's so interesting to hear that side. And I would just say, we don't want people to ever go forward with talking points. A lot of what we work with people on is, why does this matter to you? What's in your heart? And not going with a sort of stifled, prepped talking points. But when people get nervous, they ramble. I know I've done it in interviews before, and they end up talking about something that's totally unrelated. And then they sort of are regretful. And so more it's just, helping people, or they might default to using a lot of jargon if you're sort of a policy wonk or into the data, and they forget to talk about actually why it matters, or maybe their own personal story or connection. So when we practice, we don't try to make people sound so rehearsed, but we try to throw different scenarios at them so they get a little bit more comfortable. They get used to working with that adrenaline that might come up in a real interview. And they get used to, thinking oh, I really do want to talk about this solution. So if I just talk about the data, I'm going to miss that. So not rehearsed, but, just helping people feel a little bit more confident, actually getting to what's in their heart and not just what's in their head.
This is more of a reflection as we're talking. I'm kind of, thinking of all these stories I've done in the past and some of the challenges I encountered with, building trust with sources. And, I think it is, trust is built, and I think it does take time to develop those relationships with reporters and vice versa with advocates or with the people that we're interviewing. And I don't really know what the solution to this is, but I just had this reflection of, a few years ago, I wrote about a whole building that was being Ellis acted in the Tenderloin. And one of the lead sources that I was interviewing was a senior, and she had a really compelling story. And we were planning to use her photo for the front page. And obviously, that was all consent. And then very last minute, right before we went to publication, she had a change of heart. And that kind of spiked the whole story, you know, and I think those are some of the issues that I've personally encountered in my reporting where, you know, we're ready to do this. We've spent a lot of time on a story, and then there might be some fear or some kind of distress that comes through and derails it. And I don't really know how to solve that at this moment. I'm just kind of putting that out there as something to think about.
I think it's also just important for, like, I know that it can be hard, but just trusting the reporting process. You know, I do sense that there's a difference when I meet someone kind of out in life, and talk with them. I mean, obviously, like as a reporter, but you know, I've found them because this thing is happening, and I wasn't necessarily connected to them through an advocate. And I think that those voices are really important. And the best stories for me have come from talking to a really wide variety of sources. And often the most important thing is just getting people to talk to us, because sure, you're going to have imperfect stories, but or you know, imperfect interviews, but lacking voices, and having entire marginalized groups who are not talking with us at all that's what perpetuates a lot of these issues. And we have to be very responsible, often reaching out into communities who have not spoken with the media before, and be very responsible about what are the consequences of you know, sharing your story. But I'd rather talk with someone who's uncomfortable talking on background, just so basically not to be quoted, but to learn what's happening to them, than to not know it at all, because otherwise that's how sort of the usual narrative gets perpetuated.
Yeah, that's exactly it. If people who are not familiar with speaking with the press don't, then the prevailing narrative is the one that it comes from people who are very well practiced, very well trained to do this. And that, you know, has results, consequences, you might call them.
Yeah, and just responding to, like, what a great discussion. Like, I didn't even have to jump in. It's just happening all naturally. But one question that comes up after hearing from you all is, you know, I think because I used to be on the communication side, where I had to, you know, always be informing journalists what's going on around affordable housing in San Francisco and Bay Area. And like, it seemed like when I was working in that space, like a few years ago, there was more time to really dig in and have more conversations on a background and build those relationships. And it seems like over time, there seems to be a shift in that more and more journalists are strapped for time, because a lot of our like our news ecosystem is not as strong as it used to be. And a lot of journalists that I've interacted with have been spread so thin, having to cover so many things, whether it's just housing, because there's so much to cover in housing, but also balancing multiple beats as well. And so I'm wondering, from like a systematic point of view, like how can we better work together as advocates and housing journalists to do the best reporting? And like, how have you seen the housing beat shift over time? And like, just what are ways systematically we can do to help support you as housing reporters?
I think, you know, for if you don't have an established relationship yet with a reporter, I think it's really important to get to know what they cover and just really tailor what you the pitch is, or the story is that you're hoping to share, to what they cover and make it relevant, because it's hard for us to like for example, my beat right now is very, I'm on this certain beat and that's what I do, and it's hard for me to sometimes make a case to step out of that. I can, and that does happen, but I think it's just really important to get to kind of know the reporter's audience and who they're writing for, and work with that.
And I think this, and to sort of answer that and the question that was asked in the chat, of how we build trust with people in communities that are their experts on their own issues, but not necessarily the policy experts. Getting time to build trust versus make deadline. I think that all of us make time for what is necessary, but we do have pressures from our editors. We're all under incredible pressure. I'm very lucky in my current organization, Cal Matters, where I don't have, it's not a daily paper. I'm not having to put out a story every day, or but a lot of our news organizations are, and do get a lot of pressure. And so I think it does help, when it comes sometimes to the advocacy side, to help us make that pitch to our editors of, this is a really important story and here's why, and maybe having the advocate more so explain why this particular story is relevant to our beat. So for me, for example, affecting state policy, and having the advocate help make that argument, so that then we can also ask our editor to let us spend more time. But overall, it really does just take time to do our jobs, and we can be building trust with people just by talking with them, just by engaging continuously, by checking in, by not abandoning them after writing a story, and just kind of disappearing. There's a lot of things that we can do. And I think sometimes that just falls on the reporter, that I know reporters who are under incredible pressure and still make time to call, their on the ground sources, to just check in. So I think it is a collaborative process, but the stories that have the most impact are the ones that we spend the most time really connecting on the ground to the people most affected. And I think that deep down, readers can tell, listeners, and editors as well. So it's just an investment on everyone's part.
I think that the landscape, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
No, you go ahead, Laura.
I think the media landscape around this and the coverage is really multifaceted. Like, different publications prioritize different things. Some publications, and by as a result, their reporters are under enormous pressure to deliver material at volume and fast. And some publications are under enormous pressure to deliver stories that will have measurable impact. And what that means and how they define it is a little bit squishy, I think. Sometimes it depends on the publication. I mean, a lot of publications have been taken over and gutted. Some publications in San Francisco are brand new on the scene and are on a hiring spree and can afford to put multiple reporters on the same beat. And it just depends on the publication. But what you end up with is different reporters across different media outlets who are subject to very different pressures and might handle a story very differently. Some may have time to spend on an investigative piece that takes many months. Some may not. And I think it kind of depends on the story too, whether that's a good fit for that particular reporter at that time. Because, if it is something that needs a much more investigative or perhaps an engagement reporting treatment, then some newsrooms may be equipped to handle that and some may not. And I saw that somebody asked a question about whether reporters get the time to build trust with affected communities. So people who are experts in their experiences, who are really crucial to these stories. It depends. It depends on the publication, I think, whether you get the time to build that. But yeah, like Manuela was saying, it is definitely something that you need the time for, and it's an investment on everyone's part. And I just think that it differs from one publication to the next a lot, and maybe even from one assignment to the next with the same reporter.
And just to kind of answer that first part of that question, you know, how reporters build trust, and I think it was said earlier, but just not parachuting into a community or picking an issue up once and then kind of disappearing from the scene. You know, obviously nobody wants to feel like they're deserted or left behind. But there are, you know, boundaries, and there are some, I have had experienced moments in my career where I have connected with sources and I have given an issue a lot of coverage, and, you know, I couldn't solve the situation, or I couldn't help. And it's hard to kind of let go of, to know when to let go of stories, you know, and move on sometimes. And I think that's just something that, you know, individually I grapple with. And I think also, yeah, just the parachuting in, and also just making a case, you know, in my current job, I have a lot of pressure to produce, you know, and I think that hasn't always been the case in other newsrooms, but so what Laura said, that's really true. It just depends on where you're at. But I think building trust is also sometimes pushing back against your editors and kind of making a case for why a story should hold, and it shouldn't run right away just because we want to be first. Sometimes waiting and doing more work or doing more research or more interviews really makes the story better, but it is hard to push back sometimes when you know the editorial cycle is really fast.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Manuela, if you want to answer the question from Daphne as well. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Renaissance Journalism Center. They're a fabulous organization, and Daphne is wonderful. And so, yeah, how does a reporter build trust? And, you know, is there that time given to build trust versus making a deadline?
Yeah, I think that that journalism is not that different from all of our other, you know, all other parts of life, where it's through continued engagement, continued conversations, back and forth, asking questions, returning, not sort of just, yeah, coming, writing a story and leaving. That these are things that, no, we don't get explicit time to do. I don't think any of us really do. Even like first week on the job, oh, maybe you have some time to like get coffee with people, and then, you know, you're on to the next deadline. But as I said before, like, I think that we can make time and push for that. And I think another part that's important for all of our sources to know is that there's no be all and end all story. Like, I might be working on one story and I get so many good ideas and so many good quotes, and then inevitably I'm going to disappoint people because I'm not going to be able to include everything that they said. But I'm going to be able to go back to it, you know, and sometimes that's also part of it, is just because I didn't get to all of it in one story, is like, you know, it's on both people sort of to continue that conversation, but often on us as reporters to go back and try and continue, telling those stories that we only told sometimes because of our deadlines. But I think that we can make it work, and we have a responsibility to make it work, no matter how much pressure is put on us on sort of the delivery side.
Because and I just want to backtrack to the piece on solutions-based reporting. So I understand that from your perspective, it could be it's difficult reporting. And then you mentioned that, individuals, we know what the problems are, and those are very well articulated. But when it comes to the solutions-based reporting, what I have often seen is that the focus is on the individuals or persons who are being the most impacted by those things around housing. And so while they may have an idea, because a lot of the people that we pick out or we interview for those type of stories about the solutions, what can be solutions, they are so impacted by all the other, what I call daily hassles of life. But there's never the connecting pieces. And while they might know in their minds what can be some viable solutions, there could be an outreach to organizations or people that work with the most impacted people when it comes to housing issues, homelessness, home ownership, displacement, to be able to connect with them and to be able to do more to talk with them about what are some viable solutions. As I pointed out in the chat, at BARHII, we think that for this region, our housing solution, our housing strategy, Black housing strategy, is a solution to the overall, what we think of as these disparities that are impacting the displacement of African American regions, throughout the region and throughout the state as well, and to become a national model for what it would take to do more housing-based solutions. And so what I would say that when we are looking to do solutions are out there. But I do think that it takes more to be able to connect with organizations that represent people that are trying to do solutions, and then also check, there's a lot of budget requests right now in the California's, state Senate and Assembly that have, housing budget requests attached to them. And within these budget requests, there are a lot of solution-based things that are going on. And so I think it's doing a deeper dive into, where are the solutions held at, and where are people talking about these housing solutions, and then to be able to really. So thank you.
Thank you, Darris. Does anyone want to respond to Darris?
I think this gets back to what we were talking about before a little bit. It is difficult to report on theoreticals, hypotheticals, so solutions that have not yet been implemented, particularly if they're looking for funding, right? It's by definition something that is not yet in progress. So it's difficult to probe those things when they're not yet in motion. If they are, then that's a way for a reporter to sort of look at the proposal by on the basis of what it has achieved so far. One of the challenges with with solutions journalism is that you're trying to start from a point of, well, what are people doing about this? Like, you do have to explain the problem, but then you go into what are people doing about this? And if it's if those solutions are still in the ideas stage, then it's very difficult to sort of test them. One of the ways to test them, and I think this speaks to one of the questions that someone has posed, is to check the assumptions in the proposal or check the basis of the proposal with other people who might disagree. And that can be a very unpleasant process, I think, for the folks who are putting forward the solution, because of course you have an idea, you are pretty certain it's going to work, and then someone comes along and is like, I'm going to try and poke holes in that. And that's unpleasant and difficult and introduces some tension, but I think it's also the way that we have to probe proposals in the same way that we as journalists are asked to probe, say, legislation or other attempts to do things, proposals when they come before us to do a story about them. We are encouraged, I think, in general, to not just put out, like, regurgitate what is given to us, but to question it and see if there are other thoughts about it, and to test it a little bit.
I think that it's a really good point what Darris said in terms of sometimes more so like what stories we choose to do, because Laura makes a good point, right? A lot of these budget proposals haven't been tested, but often actually they're asking to invest more money, to spend more money on programs that are already out there. So looking at, okay, what are these programs and how much of an effect they have made? And something that has been a big challenge for me in terms of doing that kind of story is there's a lot of laws California has passed in the last 5 years that have not had any kind of reporting requirements attached. Different streamlining laws, for example, that have no reporting requirements. And so there's actually very little data on, okay, how many projects have been completed as a result of this law. And so sometimes my stories, are about in homelessness, particularly, how little reporting there is about the kind of impact that a program has had. But I do think that looking for those kind of stories and trying to do as much of them as possible is a lot more helpful than just saying X group is asking for X amount of money. If I'm able to just look at one program that's asking for this particular budget allocation, but that has been in the works for a long time and has really worked in X county, that's for me a great story. And then just in general, unpacking assumptions, I always like to ask who disagrees with you, whoever I talk with, to see who's on the opposing side and try to talk to them as much as possible. But as we've discussed, there's plenty of groups that have thoughts on certain issues, but for example, on a bill might not appear in the oppose or support section. And so again, it's up to us to reach out to folks and for folks to reach out to us and share their opinion, because otherwise we just won't get it in such a quick news cycle.
Something comes to mind there about, when solutions are proposed and then they need money to be implemented, which is just a reality. Like, we need people who are trying to solve things need money to execute those solutions in many, many cases. I think that one of the criticisms that's raised is often, Manuela, you were talking about when something has been proposed and it's actually returning for funding. One of the criticisms raised is often, well, the actual overarching problem has not been solved yet, therefore this approach is clearly not working, which I think is like, that's where we come in. That's where journalists come in to probe that a little bit deeper, because that analysis alone, I think, is too much on the surface level, when often the response from the people who are trying to solve the problem is, okay, but the reason why it didn't work is because there wasn't enough investment into this, or we don't have enough resources, whether it's money or otherwise. And I think that's where we can come in and kind of complicate the narrative a little bit, or at least, challenge assumptions like XYZ is not solved yet, therefore the approach didn't work. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper than that.
I would say that with the issue of housing, it's not you are not going to see solutions-based results overnight, because it's so in-depth, right? The other piece is that with the issue as big as housing at all levels, whether it's homelessness, first-time home ownership for African Americans, asset retentions. You know, it's something that there are going to be. I know for BARHII, we have put together a proposal that is going to have reporting mechanisms. But the thing is, how do you measure whether something is working in a year or 2 or 3 or even 4 when the next government official is up for re-election? You will only be, you know, it's almost like it's impossible to do it in that amount of time. And as you, and also as you are dealing with that one aspect of housing alone, then what we see in this type of work is that there's always something else that comes up to add to the existing problems that already exist, right? And so I think that then maybe, you know, as we talk about solution-based reporting, how do we develop better ways of talking about solutions without or reporting on what could be viable solutions? Because I know, I mean, if you look at this year, right, in the state of California, if you look at the amount of money that came out last year for housing and stuff like that, it was all based upon we had this huge surplus, and by all accounts, the surplus will be a little bigger this year than what was previously thought. But what happens when next year or the year after you don't have these big huge surpluses? What happens when you go into you know, these great big recessions that like happened in 2008? And so what I'm saying is that, you know, it takes a whole brain trust. It takes talking to, you know, people about solutions that might do, you know, we might have to start talking about forecasting what could, you know, step back, you know, viable things that could be solutions that have not had the chance to materialize. Because what we do know is that problems arise all the time, right? And so, you know, and they're going to keep arising, and they will arise more often than we are turning out solutions. So that's what I would say. And I, by all means, I would say, you know, if I was an expert in all fields, finance, politics, all these things, maybe I could like wave that magic wand, but I can't, or neither can no one else, because no one, but there's many ways of which we can at least begin to focus the conversation on solutions, whether it's things that are people that are, and if we start focusing on the solutions, maybe that will force more of the political will, the corporate will, and all these other things to really move and get deep dive into, let's get into problem solving and really make a commitment to it, and so that we can see it through. And that's what I would say.
Thank you for that. And Kathi, I know you've had your hand up, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, just was going to say, you know, one of the things I think we can do as public health practitioners, as housing justice folks, to help unpack some of these assumptions is, one is help provide, you know, compelling sources to journalists. One of the things that we've seen a lot that's fairly ubiquitous in housing coverage is relying on certain groups as experts. So a lot of times when there's reporting on housing trends, Zillow's quoted, or real estate lobby, landlord lobby on data. But BARHII has a ton of data on what are the forecasting, what happens when people are evicted. And what we have a lot of health data on, the cost, both human and monetary costs that can come, if people aren't able to stay in their homes during COVID. And I think sometimes, my background is public health, and my training, we're more able to speak to other public health folks, and sometimes the way we talk about it isn't very compelling. It's hard to understand. We present data in ways that are a little bit wonky. And so really the type of communication we might do to journalists is very different than we might present in an academic journal. And a lot of times there's not a lot of resources for these people doing this very interesting research to translate some of those findings into things that are easily to understand for the public. And so that is where, we have resources, we have best practices for doing that. We have ways to, turn very big numbers into things that are easily understandable. And so some of our work is just to try to help organizations do that so that it's easier to unpack those assumptions. The other thing I think on the side of those who are creating the solutions is at some point, every solution is a hypothetical. And sometimes our status quo is so embedded and so ingrained, we don't even realize that there are holes in what is happening now that, that they don't have data, that their approach is working. They don't have actually much to show for their impact. And so we sometimes have a heavier lift of proposing new solutions. And the one that comes to mind is thinking about non-police response to homelessness, and forming mental health response and forming a response where it's actually de-escalating things. And at one point, the very first pilot program, that was completely hypothetical, but it was predicated on some data that the current system's not working, that it actually escalates, that it actually harms people. That there are lived experience from people who have been harmed in this way, that where they felt if a mental health professional was there, it could have de-escalated the situation. It actually got people the help they needed, actually helped the people, the neighbors around feel more safe as well. So, we try to work with people to think it's a long haul. And I think the point really, Manuela, that you made, that no one story is going to cover everything. So as an advocate, you can't expect one op-ed or one story to tell everything. So if you're starting this pilot program on a mental health response, are there other areas you can point to where it's worked? Or if you're the very first one, maybe it's harder to pitch a story to a reporter. Maybe you can get an op-ed in where you're sharing your proposed hypothetical and the reasons why you believe it will work, the impact you think it will have. And then maybe the next story, you can try to build in more data or more resources. And it is a long haul. Unfortunately, we'd love to solve these issues overnight on our end because we see the public health ramifications, we see the harm. But we also see that when people build in communication resources and build in thinking about how are we going to communicate with reporters all along our, maybe 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10-year trajectory of passing something, then they are able to sort of build on these stories. I think tracking reporters and understanding which reporters may have the freedom to do a longer piece or, question some of these hypotheticals or interview folks from different cities where it is working is helpful. And then knowing that some reporters are on very fast deadlines and maybe don't have the length to really delve into it. And thinking about who you pitch to is another way that we can be a little bit better prepared and be better sources.
Yeah, and I do want to lift up one question in the chat, and I think I already know the answer to this, but it looks like there's someone, Denny Donis, that is facing an Ellis Act eviction, and she's organizing a few demonstrations in front of her house, and she's wondering if you have any suggestions. I know it's probably sometimes hard for you guys to kind of report on these like types of events because unfortunately they're happening all of the time everywhere. And so I'm wondering if you have any advice for her for that particular event.
I just want to clarify the question. Is it on getting help for the eviction or more so how to publicize it and reaching out to local media?
Yeah, I think it's that, like, would this be a type of story any of you would be interested in, or if there are other, if there's other helpful things we can do as advocates to get your interest in a story like this, stuff like that.
Just to answer for myself, we usually will cover things, as I said before, sort of from the statewide perspective. So I did write about an Ellis Act eviction recently while covering a bill to address Ellis Act evictions from Alex Lee. So we remember Alex Lee. So, I think that if you want my kind of publication to write about this kind of incident, it would be more from, the policy perspective, but I'm not based in San Francisco, so I don't really know more so what would be. So I guess that advice is more so for the policy advocate to help make that connection, and why, this particular eviction is a really good example for the state to pay attention to, as opposed to only just San Francisco.
I just want to add on, I know Denny, hi, and I'm really sorry that you're going through that. And I had planned to go to the April 28th event. I would have also, approached this from a bigger kind of perspective, because I work, I feel like this would be a really good community story. But I work for a business journal, so I would approach it from a different perspective. But I think the one thing that I, just to support Denny, I wanted to show up. And I remember just having a conflict on that day, and I just saw it on social media like the night before. So I think just being proactive and reaching out to reporters and giving them enough time to kind of plan the week, obviously some events you can't do that, some things are on the spot, but I think just, reaching out to the reporters who would have, as we discussed, would have time to cover an event like that, or even work on a bigger story that examines Ellis Act evictions and the rise of in San Francisco or whatever. So I think that just kind of working and giving enough time and a heads up helps. And if a reporter can't make it to the event, do a phone call, do a Zoom, or figure out another way to connect. That goes both ways, not just for the source.
And I just add from our end that, one, not certain in this situation, also just knowing how hard this is and sending, wishes that there is some way out of this. But working with organizations can be helpful because they often may have more media capacity. They might have press contacts. So if you aren't plugged into an organization, there's a lot in San Francisco, some on this call even, that you might be able to partner with to, one, deal with some of the policy and legal issues, and two, they might help you pitch your story. They might help you connect it to the broader issue with Ellis Act evictions. They might be able to connect it to other resources that make a more compelling pitch. And they might be able to help you organize and connect to other folks in the same situation. So not just on the communication end, but as an organizing strategy so that you are not alone. So we would just really recommend that. And we have a lot of resources for people to think through what their strategy is. So it's knowing what you want to ask for. Is it just about one eviction, or are you trying to connect to a broader policy you want San Francisco or the state to pass? And thinking about, being really clear what you're asking in this moment, and, making sure that's part of all your materials as well.
And this is probably going to be our last question. So this is a personal interest of mine while I was working at Choo is how much journalists can get into politics that influence policy, like outside of the pros and cons of policy. Like, are these types of investigations around politics not as relevant as the policy itself or the story of the people impacted? I know that's kind of a little complicated, but I'm just wondering if there's Yeah, and I'm wondering if for Fernando, you want to expand on that, just since we both worked at Choo Choo around this, and we'd have a lot of convos around this.
Well, I'm happy to add, sort of an example would be housing, new housing construction versus housing preservation, right? Two aspects of how we, as policy, deal with housing issues. Building something new for a politician means you get to go to, with a golden shovel and do a groundbreaking and do ribbon cutting at the end. And there's a lot of, I think very similar to transit projects as well. There's the big construction projects that have a lot of construction companies that benefit from that and also contribute to campaigns. And then there's the little things, right? Like hiring enough bus drivers or preserving housing for folks on the ground. And there's a different set of players there, who might be the folks who might be getting evicted, or like the LSAC question earlier, or organized labor with the bus drivers. But I feel there's a lot of influence around what gets funded more or less that may or may not have to do with which policy is better as much as the politics that are behind it, right? Or the interest of the political or economic actors. And so wondering how you as reporters who are reporting on policies and reporting on the impact that those policies have on people can kind of extricate those politics that might be behind there, or is that getting too complicated or too confusing? I know Laura Wenus, you said you want to hear the complication. You don't want us to talk down or simplify, but sometimes the story can be really complicated, maybe too complicated. I don't know.
Well, I think since you spoke to me by name, yeah, I think that we have to treat readers and listeners and viewers as intelligent as they are. People do actually have a lot of capacity to understand stuff. But one thing that makes it complicated is when people won't come straight out and say what they mean. And that when people are kind of talking around stuff and they leave it to the reporter to try and tease out what exactly does that mean? Like who's accusing whom of what here exactly? And that's something that puts us in a very precarious position. We don't want to be interpreting into what you're telling us and hope that we're right. That's very dangerous territory.
Just to expand on what Laura just said, often we'll do an interview and we'll get a quote accusing someone of something, but we can't just republish. We can't just publish anything that someone says. We need to be able to back it up, even if it's a quote. I think that sometimes people don't really understand that, but it's still our name attached. We're still amplifying this voice. And so we need to be able to fact check what a source is saying, just as much as, the writing that's not in quotes. If this makes sense. And so, I think that, we had a meeting with our editors here at Cal Matters recently, and they said how important it is to be able to explain, like our role is definitely to be able to explain decision-making, and politics plays a huge role in that, and political contributions, donations, like these things are all, what's happening behind the scenes is some of the most important stuff that we can be reporting on. And that's what I try to focus my stories on, is everything that's not visible, that's still playing a hand in what we're seeing. But it's one thing to be able to point me in the direction of, look, this is how much money X campaign contributed, versus just saying, oh, developers are always, spending money on this and that thing. So, if you're able to point to a paper trail and help us do that reporting to be able to corroborate what you're telling us, it's going to have a much greater chance of actually making it into the story than just waving around allegations that then give us a lot of work to do to be able to to confirm. And that's when the deadlines come in. We're like, we can't prove this thing.
I think that was well said by both of you guys. I couldn't agree more.
I would also add that for things that you can't point to dollar amounts or contracts or whatever, there are still, there's still a really big difference between saying, well, I know that XYZ party is using political influence to try and get this thing pushed through, versus saying, I received a call from XYZ party and they told me that if I didn't support this policy, this other consequence would occur. And I think what we run into often is that people imply things, but then when it's time for us to try and get it onto the record and check it and go, did you say this? Did you say that? People are no longer willing to talk about it because it's difficult.
All right, well, we are approaching the hour and a half for this event. So I am going to pass the baton to Fernando Marti to close us out.
Thank you. And I did want to close us out by just mentioning that this is part of a series of Affordable Housing Week events. This has been a fantastic afternoon. Thank you, Laura and Manuela and Maya and Kathi and Darris. There are a few other events still coming up as part of Affordable Housing Week. So I just want to let you all know, tomorrow night, we will have an event on housing preservation against displacement, which I referred to a little bit in my question. That will be going on tomorrow night at 5:30. It will be a virtual event, again, on Zoom and Facebook Live. And then the following night, Thursday night, we will have a teach-in on the empty homes tax with Faith in Action and Democratic Socialists of America. That will be a bilingual event in English and Spanish in person at St. John's Church in the Mission District. And if I can get my technology together, we will be live streaming that as well. So again, thank you very much, and it's been good seeing you all. And we'll see you in the streets and working on policy.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.